Life is a quest for logic and reason. It is a quest to find balance between science and faith. Life is a quest for knowledge and understanding. But most importantly, it's a quest for personal discovery. Whatever your quest, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. Welcome to Quest. Hi, Caitlin. Welcome to the Quest podcast.
Hi, Todd. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to interview you today. I've just started my 7th season of the Quest podcast, and you looked like a really interesting guest to bring on in the first handful of episodes. I'm very curious about your journey. You have a book out called Meditations for Party Girls.
Yes.
And the title just grabbed me right away. And I'm like, what is this about? Who is this person? And I think, and of all places, I think I saw you on Instagram Threads, which I seldom ever find anyone I'm interested in, but I saw your stuff there. And I was like, all right, I got to dig into this and see what this is about. So this is your, I'm assuming, nonfiction book.
Yes. Yes.
And it just told me right out of the gate, this person has some stories to get to this place to write a book like this. And when I read the description on Amazon, it said that this is actually through journals, poems, notes, and reflections. And I thought, wow, that's a really interesting way to craft the book. So I was hoping you might come on and talk about it. And this is your debut book, right?
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So first off, just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dig into kind of what the book's about.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's like my story and the book story are very intertwined at this point. So it's easy to kind of do both in one answer, or we'll see if I do that. Born and raised in Los Angeles, and I spent my 20s playing in like punk and rock bands in the kind of like DIY scene is what we called it. Punk is a bit of a misnomer just because like people, I think when you say punk, imagine like spiked hair and leather jackets. And it was more just, like a bunch of misfits, like people who, were marginalized. I apologize in advance if my cat starts screaming at me, and
It's okay. We're cat people here, so it's all right.
So while that was going on, simultaneously, I started playing in the music scene like mid-20s. In my early 20s is when I had what I would call my first spiritual awakening. And it was basically the first time I was like, since I was a child, where I was like, okay, there is magic. It's a real thing. I don't understand. I had grown up to be kind of a cynical adult, arts and sciences. And then, as things happened to me that I couldn't explain, I became more interested in spirituality. I started having panic attacks when I was like 19 that would involve my hands going numb. And one time, like even I couldn't walk, like my legs were paralyzed. I didn't know what they were. I got all kinds of tests. Finally, the doctors were like, oh, you're having panic attacks. And they gave me lorazepam. I took it one time and I was like, this isn't really the drug for me. I feel nothing. I'd rather feel like all the craziness. And in the meantime, I had started, smoking weed every day, drinking as heavily as any other, like 20 something. And I went to a yoga class. I was living at the time on the West Side in LA and finishing out my degree in screenwriting. And my friend took me to Brian Kest's power yoga class. And Brian Kest is this yoga teacher that he basically invented power yoga, like what we know as like kind of the vigorous vinyasa yoga. And he has this studio in Santa Monica that since the beginning has been donation based. So you can, when you're broke, you can go pay $2 a dollar. And then obviously people give more, but it was always just a box in the back. And these classes would get, like shoulder to shoulder, and they wouldn't be heated, but you'd be pouring sweat by the end because there were so many people in this room. And and he also talks for like almost 2 hours. It's supposed to be an hour yoga class, and he just like doesn't stop. And so it was one of those like kind of pivotal experiences, because in Shavasana at the end, I had what I had been experiencing as a panic attack, but I was just laying and like my body was kind of in this fully relaxed state. And I experienced it for the first time, not as like anxiety, like, oh, I'm having like a medical event where my hands are tingling and I can't move my jaw. I was just like, oh, my hands are tingling and I can't move my jaw, but I'm breathing and I'm like in this state of bliss. And so that was really interesting to me. That got me hooked on yoga from a very early age. And I started learning to manage my anxiety with yoga and meditation then. That was around like 2007 or 8. And kind of started working. I won't go into like all, my whole life story, I guess. But basically, like as I was becoming this more, entrenched in partying and fucking off, which was sort of a reaction to my upbringing, which was very rigidly academic. I ended up going into both this spirituality, healing practitioner, career path, moving away from writing for a long time. And then also having this side of me where I was like, my alcoholism was developing. I'm over a year sober now, so I can now identify it as alcoholism. But at the time I was like, I just party like everyone else, Meanwhile, like having no idea that like I had all kinds of trauma and stuff that I was covering up. I experienced sexual assault in like 2000, like around then. So that it just everything was kind of like intensifying, but also like I ended up moving. What happened is I ended up moving to this cabin in the middle of. So I left Los Angeles, and my first burnout, which was I was like 24 years old, moved to this cabin on an off-grid piece of land. It was a weed farm in Watsonville, California, and called Cosmic Dance. And I just used to write every day. And I've always written every single day in my journal since I could write. So like 7 or 8 years old. And while I was there, I was working as a remote video editor. And then I wanted to become a yoga teacher. And I knew that like yoga certification was a thing, but I was also like, yoga's not, I didn't want to do like core power yoga. No offense to that kind of stuff, but I was like, I'm not doing this for like the aesthetics and for like, even for physical fitness. Like what I'm interested in is this magic sort of spiritual philosophical practice at the core of it. And then what ended up happening was I found weirdly that I was living in the same mountain range as Mount Madonna Center. Mount Madonna was founded in, I want to say the 1970s by Baba Hari Das, who was actually he was a silent Indian guru. When I went there, he was in his 80s. He'd been silent since like the 1950s, and he built this place. He was a teacher of Ram Dass. He was like in that whole like Timothy Leary sort of, and he had like this reputation for having these magic powers. Like people would talk about how he used to fly and stuff, and it was so cool to me. I went to that yoga training and it was so intense. We were waking up at 4 a.m. meditating. There was an hour of asana a day. It was so not asana focused. It was focused on the philosophy, on hours of meditation, on a really bland diet, 4 hours of sleep. And that was when I started having my first, like, I call them like sober psychedelic experiences. I had my first out of body experience. I started to see my life as like a video game. I was kind of like gaining this different perspective, and he gave me a name. We got to experience he passed away in 2018, so I feel really lucky to have gotten this like tail end of his teachings. But once or twice a week, we would have these classes where he would answer questions on a tablet. It used to be a stone tablet, but like it was like an iPad or something when I was there. And he had this ability to, you could ask him the most complex philosophical question and he would just give you a one-word answer and it would be meaningful. We had the opportunity to get Sanskrit names assigned from him. The name he gave me was Satya, and then he wrote goddess of creation. And I was like, that's really weird. Satya in Sanskrit translates to essentially like, I am that, like I'm the truth. It's like this essence of truth and beingness has nothing to do with a goddess or creation. So I thought that was really unusual. I ended up Googling it, And what came up before I had ever heard of like the Pleiadian agenda or, whatever, it brought me to this document that was in this like GeoCities or Angel Fire page or something.
That's way back.
Yeah, that was like, I'm Satya, goddess of the like creation, like, and it said I'm like the keeper of the libraries of the Pleiades, and it was this channeled work by Barbara Handclough. And it was just this like mind blowing. I was like, does he know about this, or is this a coincidence? Does it matter? That was like this whole thing. So
I've always heard that name associated with architect.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, if you look up, Sanskrit is so hard to translate.
Yeah, I know, right? Like but it's still in the ballpark still, though, creator, architect,
Yeah, totally.
if you took that route with it.
Absolutely. So fast forward, I ended up, joining rock and roll bands, drinking a lot more, always meditating to sort of be like, this is how I stay alive, is having this balance. I became a massage therapist, developed more of my healing capacities. 10 years later, I ended up having my second nervous breakdown after COVID, and I had enough money saved at the time. I had an opportunity to move to Mexico, and I've always wanted to live in Mexico. At the time I was living, I've spent most of my adult life in LA. So I ended up moving down there to the central western coast, about an hour north of Puerto Vallarta, outside of Sayulita. A lot of people are familiar with that area. Yeah. And I had piles and piles of journals. At the time, I had sold I'd gotten rid of like 99% of what I owned to move down there, because I drove down there. I brought my cat, some clothes, and my journals. That was pretty much it. And when I got there, I was like, well, I can't drag these journals around for the rest of my life. So I'm going to start to transcribe over a decade's worth of stuff. I've lost and burned many journals along the way, but I was like, there's probably stuff in here that I don't want to get rid of. So I started to go, I went back as far as I could. And what was so interesting is it was exactly 10 years was like the furthest back I could find at the time. It was a journal from the time that I was at Cosmic Dance and having my first like meltdown, leave LA, live in isolation and go through spiritual transformation. And exactly 10 years later, I found myself in Mexico, living by the ocean, super isolated, didn't know anyone down there, and having ended up being this very spiritually transformative year. While I was transcribing those journals, I had been playing around with the title Meditations for Party Girls as this book idea. I thought that what I wanted to write was a book that was like self-helpy and like teaching people how to meditate, but like people who think they can't meditate. And I was never able to write that because I never felt like I had any authority on the subject. No matter how much I studied, I was like, I'm still a fucking mess. Like, how am I going to tell people, how to improve their lives? I can tell people how to stay alive if, in the midst of kind of like borderline mental illness. But what ended up happening is I transcribed enough that I was like, I actually love this, threw the title Meditations for Party Girls on it. While I was down there, I also was still writing every day. And at some point, my friend Jonathan Blake Foster, who's a writer that I'm a fan of, he had started his small press, Dreamboy Book Club, and he was soliciting like quarterly online zine submissions for poetry and prose. I sent him some stuff that I had been working on in Mexico that was like real time, and he published it. He got a really good response to it. So he ended up asking like, hey, if you have any more of this. And I was like, I have like 100 pages already of both 10 years ago and today. And so he basically sent me a contract. I had a book deal before I even had finished the book, which I know is like this incredible gift. It doesn't work like that usually. And that's, basically what it became was this. It's not about like, this is how you meditate. It's like, this is my experience trying everything I can learn about reality, about spirituality, while also having my struggles. Because I think that every party girl, quote unquote, it's like there's something behind that I'm not saying everyone's an addict, but probably a lot of those people, the reason you find yourself partying is because you have this kind of thirst for extreme life and extreme adventure, extreme feelings, emotions, catharsis. And a lot of that comes from trauma, or being a highly sensitive person. And so stuff like meditation, it's weird to me that so few people actually inhabit both worlds. But it's been like really cool to kind of be, I consider this kind of work and my life in general to be like creating a bridge between those worlds. So sorry, I just talked your ear off, but
no, it's great. You basically almost answered all the questions I had, but now I have a lot of new questions.
Great.
So we're gonna dig into the book a little bit later in the interview, but you've given a significant amount of your young life story because you're still a very young person.
I'm 37. I'm the youngest of the old people, I would say.
Are you? You're definitely millennial.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. You're definitely a millennial. Yeah. So I think let's go back a little bit. Like, first off, I want to say that this LA story is very common. I meet so many people with the exact same LA experience story. Their experiences, in creativity, getting their screenwriting degree, finding yoga, checking out of LA for a bit, some people joining cults, like this is a very common thing I always hear. Now, I'm not trying to like minimize your personal story, but this is an LA thing. I mean, unless I lived in Southern California for a while. I'm from Indiana originally. So I was like right off the bus from Indiana, working in entertainment, film and TV. And I did that for a long time, developed my alcoholism in Southern California. So getting more money that I'd ever made before. I made more money than I ever made before when I was there. And I left with no money.
Yeah. So it happens.
And you make bar friends. You see these extraordinarily big paychecks from working on TV. And then you're like, what do I do with this? Buy everyone in the bar drinks. And then you're invited to their after parties and and the bartenders make top shelf drinks for you. And then all of a sudden you don't want to go back to work because you have bar friends.
Yeah.
So a TV show, Saved by the Bell, would call and they would say, this is how old I am. Saved by the Bell would call and say, do you want to come work on the show? And I'm like, nah, I'm good up here. Hanging out on the beach. So that happens, right? To transplants and I think to people that grow up there. So I have my own story of kind of falling apart out there. But it's something I see that's very common. So I want to go back to like your young life. Tell me about, how you grew up. You grew up in LA? That's your hometown.
Yeah.
Did you grow up spiritual and religious? What was it like? Did you have a big family? What was that dynamic?
Well, I do want to say, like, I do think, if you don't move to LA and fall apart, you're not doing it right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Just go to Chicago or something if you just want to have like a straight line.
You can fall apart there too.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah. But I think so. I grew up born and raised in Pasadena, which is technically Los Angeles, but it is a bit suburban. It's very white picket fence.
There's homes there. Yeah.
Yeah, there's nature. I grew up at the base of the mountains, the San Gabriel Mountains. I used to be able to hike to a waterfall from my house, so I grew up very like surrounded by nature. My dad was really into nature. My parents divorced when I was 8. And so I mostly grew up with my mom. That's
the first trauma.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there were plenty sprinkled along the way and before and after, but I was the youngest of 4. I had a very tense household. My older 2 siblings had a different dad. It was just very, my mom was holding it together. She, to me, seemed very conservative because she was 45 when she had me. So she was I was, youngest of 2 14-year marriages. I saw her as an older person, like relative to how she was when she started being a mom. It's like my oldest sister has a totally different experience of her. But it's funny to think of my mom as conservative now that I'm older because she moved to California from St. Paul. She grew up in a tiny town in Minnesota called St. James, I think. St. James, population of like 800 people. Moved to St. Paul and then moved to California when she was 19, like in the middle of the night with her roommate. which honestly is like more radical than me moving to Mexico from LA, you know, when I think about it, because she didn't have GPS, she didn't have Airbnb. I had my trip all planned meticulously. She just got in a car and went, you know.
Yeah.
And
that's what I did.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she always seemed really conservative to me. We were technically Episcopalian, but that was not, my mom actually did introduce me to Buddhism and stuff when I was younger. She dealt with a lot of she was very creative and artistic and sensitive, Pisces woman, but she didn't have any outlet other than being a mom, which is, you know, poisonous to both child and parent. And so I remember reading Deepak Chopra when I was like 10 years old and being like, I can't meditate. This is stupid. I can't clear my head. And she really sincerely tried. She by no means was a Buddhist or anything, but she would go on some retreats and stuff sometimes. And, you know, but she also had the like Southern California, you know, like leather jacket. She was a smoker, bottle blonde hair, convertible. Her best friend was the hairstylist that was like one of the like a heavy metal rocker's mom. And so
that's very 70s LA right there you're describing.
She used to live in Laurel Canyon in the 70s when the Manson murders happened, so she was also deeply paranoid about me being murdered. You know. But she severe depression by the time I was a teenager, and she barely left the house. There was a lot of responsibility on me to be her caretaker, basically. So that was kind of like, I would say some of my main core trauma comes from that. Like, I think that's why I even became a massage therapist. Like, in a lot of things that I'm a highly sensitive person, because I was, you know, in this environment where I wouldn't go as far to call my mom like a narcissist. I think she just was, you know, like adult children of dysfunctional family, like that system of 12-step program.
Was your mom a baby boomer, or was she a Gen X, early Gen X?
She was a boomer, I think. She was born.
It sounds like she might have been a boomer.
47.
Yeah, that's boomer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, they're really kind of seeing now, looking back on that generation, it was a very selfish generation. Mm-hmm. Really was.
Yeah. And she was selfish in the people-pleasy way, where like it would be martyrdom, you know, like she would repeatedly tell me and give the message that like I was the point of her life, which is, we know now, way too much pressure to put on your child, because then, you know, I can't do anything wrong. I barely, part of the reason my party years came so much later too, is because I think I wasn't even allowed to go out. I was allowed to go to one movie every other week in high school. That was my social life until I turned 18, went to college, and lived on my own for the first time. And I just obviously just went nuts, you know?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Did you maintain a relationship with your father?
I have. Yeah. So it's been on and off. We have spent years of not speaking, and he has his own whole set of issues. He is someone that I have, you know, made amends to, and he still lives in Laguna Beach. He still has a party lifestyle. He grew up in Southern California, went to USC, you know, he's like still in touch with his frat bros, and he does the whole thing. So he doesn't even really understand why I quit drinking. You know, he was more concerned that I wouldn't have any friends. So he's very relieved that I have a social life as a post sober alcoholic.
Well, certainly there's a lot of roots to the traumas in your young life. Like, that's so much of what affects people as they get older, and how they choose to rebel, and what they do, and how different they want to be. And there's always an old saying that kids always rebel against their parents.
Oh yeah.
You know, and the hippie generation really, really hated that. I'm not saying your parents were hippies, but like the hippie generation as an example, there were a lot of kids of hippies who became attorneys and doctors,
right?
Because they're like, yeah, we watched what our parents did, you know, and their fondue parties weren't about the cheese, you know, and it was crazy. And so they led normal lives. Mm-hmm. So it's always interesting to see how children rebel against their parents and their lifestyles, even though they try to force it on them. And not in all cases, but in many. And certainly this was a lot of fuel for what would happen to you in college. I think it's interesting you got a degree in screenwriting because I think if you don't live in LA, you don't realize how big the entertainment industry is. Like it's an industry, right? And schools want to prepare you for that. In Ventura County, acting classes are required classes for students in high school.
Wow, I didn't
And
know
you
that.
think, yeah, like in the Midwest, you take industrial trades, roofing and plumbing and the average things, but in Southern California, there's required acting classes, which seems weird, but that's a huge industry, at least, for a long time, it was a huge industry. So you getting a degree in screenwriting tells me you must have wanted to, or you had some interest in film and TV. Is that fair to say?
Sure. So basically what happened, my academic journey, my mom wanted me to get a business degree. So I actually went to Northwestern for 1 year and I was an econ major. And it was very apparent to me that, like, despite a lifetime of overachieving academically and trying to fit into a box that I like couldn't fit into, I finally was like, as soon as I learned that we went off the gold standard a million years ago and like money is mostly imaginary and the only ethical backbone of economics is just more is better, I was like, capitalism isn't going to work out. I'll just be an artist, not realizing like that might be beyond my lifetime.
Yeah.
So I also read War and Peace that year. That was a class I was in at Northwestern. That totally changed my trajectory. I've always been
I just sorry to interrupt you, but like Northwestern, a specific type of indoctrination, and War and Peace, a specific type of like all these exposures are all like mini indoctrinations in a way.
Totally. I mean, it was a big, it was very confusing too, because my college fund was essentially an inheritance and I was estranged from my dad at the time. My mom didn't have any real financial input to give me as far as like how to, her only thing was like, don't depend on a man, and because she had always been not always, but she became a housewife every time she got married. And so I was like, I tried to do the whole thing where I was like, okay, I'll just go after the bag, and then as soon as I was in econ, I was like, this isn't going to work long term. I've already spent my entire life just studying and taking tests and doing math. And, like, I'm an artist. I love creating. It never even occurred to me at the time that I could major in literature and try to become a novelist, which is what I had always wanted, because that was just like not something that you did with my background.
Yeah.
And so I kept making compromises. I went to the film. I changed my major to film at Northwestern. That was a little bit better. But then I did the math finally and saw the counselor and was like, I can't afford to finish college here. So I ended up transferring to Columbia College, which is more of a trade school in Chicago. Kept the film major, moved around until I was like, well, I like writing. And I felt like very like sheepish about even admitting that. It just felt like something that my whole life I had been told, like, this is a hobby, this is something you do, and that you should be embarrassed about. And
I can expand on that actually a little bit, just from my own personal experiences. There's a lot of people that don't think of that industry as a 9-to-5 job. Sure. They look at it as a series of temp jobs, which in reality it is. I mean, you could work on the most successful TV show in the world. It still ends at a certain point. Right. You may get 10 seasons of Friends, but eventually you're unemployed.
Yeah.
In most cases, it's far less than that. So it's always looking for the next job. And with books, it's like, okay, here it is. I'm so proud of it. Now I'm out of work, and that's what parents see, right? They see a series of temp jobs. It's not real unless you clock in and you've got benefits. And that's the thing. And I feel that that's a real disservice to the creators of the world, that there are people that think like that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so eventually I actually ended up in the TV writing track. I was in a very advantageous position by the time I finished college because I had done all the internships. I had, written some pilots and whatever. I worked for Steven Zalin's production company doing coverage as an intern. And then I also worked for like Aaron Kaplan, Capital Entertainment, who used to be like this, powerhouse at William Morris. And then he left during the Endeavor takeover. And everyone was like, if you write a script, we'll buy it. That was sort of the position I was in at 21 years old. I had absolutely no idea what to write about at that age. Much less did I even really I had come from this I was in a middle-class household growing up, but surrounded by enormous wealth. I didn't see anyone being happy about being wealthy. I just saw a lot of workaholics and addicts, and so I just kind of was like, what if I just became a waitress at a tequila bar and played in punk rock bands and said, fuck you all. So that's kind of,
that's what you did.
Yeah, and it wasn't that intentional. It was more like I tried to write scripts, and that was in the years following my assault. Mentally, I was a mess. I was always high. I couldn't finish an idea. I would fill notebooks with, I could call it poetry now, but it's more like nonsense, And I would be like, if I can just keep writing, then eventually something will come out. Well, nothing came out because I had a completely disorganized mental structure. And so what I ended up doing was going down the spiritual path and leaving the industry, being very disillusioned from it, because I was assaulted by someone in the industry too. So it was like, I was like, just, fuck this.
If you don't mind me asking, and you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, obviously the assault was another trauma on top of a whole lot of other things happening. Was this a person you knew? Was this just a random kind of attack? Was this something that was part of your partying lifestyle and it just evolved into this? Like, can you give any?
So this is, I was 19 or 20 years old. I was going to Sky Bar on Sunset, Sunset
I know
Boulevard
it.
at the Mondrian.
I know the place.
Because I knew they wouldn't card me there. I could just find some 60-year-old man hanging out and grab his elbow on the way in, and he'd buy me my first round, and then I'd ditch him, and I would just spend the night doing whatever. I was enjoying all the fruits of having a successful career in LA without doing anything. I was just like, I'm just going to skim the surface. And so I considered it my own fault, especially for a long time. This was well before Me Too. So it took me 5 years to even recognize that I was assaulted. And so basically it was someone that I met out. He was so he's someone that he's now been released from prison. He's been in and out of prison for decades.
Wow.
Because he continues to kidnap, rape, assault, and terrorize people. And he is old Hollywood and has old Hollywood money and was very good looking. And it was a situation where I thought that I was being smart, and I thought I'm going on a date with this person. And then it just devolved into this thing where I ended up being psychologically terrorized.
Wow.
And he stalked me for a couple of years after. And it was something that I treated like a joke until I found out that he was going to prison and that other women had been severely hurt by this person. And I was like, oh no, I didn't realize this was a serious thing. I treated it like a joke. And I remember at the time I would tell members of my family things that happened, or that that he was texting me every morning at 5 a.m. with paragraphs. I eventually had to change my phone number. And he would show up he showed up at one of my apartments one time years later. And it would get laughed off because this was still the time period where if you brought something up like this, people would roll their eyes at you and be like, God, you're just an attention-seeking girl, basically.
Yeah.
And so it was not something I treated seriously, except that I was terrified. And I am just now, God, I'm this is 10 years, 15, almost 20 years later, and I'm still figuring out how this affected me not being able to just write a fucking screenplay when I was in my early 20s, which I don't have regrets about anymore. But it was just something at the time I was I must be a terrible writer. So that was sort of, and I would love to say his name, but also, that would not be beneficial to me at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I get it. I'm not asking you to do that.
Yeah.
It's weird. It's that kind of psychopathy. That's a whole different set of trauma. Why a person terrorizes people, multiple people like that. You hear about this a lot with Bill Cosby. Bill Cosby went after white women in particular You know, there's a lot of people that look at the lens of the Playboy Mansion of the 70s and they say, oh, well, it was the era where, you know, you took Quaaludes. Everybody was on these drugs. Like, people are rethinking what really went down at the mansion, but we were all wanting, you know, and they try to defend what went on at the Playboy Mansion. But when you look at things 30 years later, 40 years later, you see things under a different lens, both men and women, I think. I don't think it's just a female perspective of, oh, I was assaulted by Bill Cosby. But Bill Cosby's motives were really based on kind of, he hated white people so much that the way to stick it to the white man was to take the white women by any means necessary.
Yeah.
And that was why he was doing the things he was doing. And it was despicable. So there's like despicable acts like that. And there's people that are violent toward women, and those issues run deep for those people. I'm not in any way defending anyone who assaults someone, but I think everyone has traumas when they grow up, and how they put it out into the world is, you know, speaks volumes of the type of people they are. And this man was obviously a terrible predator. I'm sorry that happened to you.
Well, no, and I think it's important. I think that's such a delicate thing to bring up. But also, I'm at this point where, you know, being in a victim mindset about it, it's important to acknowledge like something happened where I was victimized. And that also, like, there is one thing I didn't love about the Me Too movement is it's like a lot of women were like taking their own accountability in situations away, and also kind of just like demonizing these people, antagonizing people, where it's like, we're all complex, you know. And
there was a lynch mob mentality in the Me Too movement, very much so.
And for good reason, you know. I definitely think like, wow, it's incredible that girls now, like, they have completely different strategies in how they deal with men. And part of it for me is that, like, I'm right on the edge of that generation where I'm like, I was playing in bands with girls that were, you know, 8-10 years younger sometimes. And a producer we were working with might say something creepy to them, and they would like make a big stink about it. And I would be like, he's doing our album for free. Like,
yeah, that's funny. You know, it's funny, the different perspectives. I just had this conversation the other day, really. But, you know, the Me Too movement terrified men. It put a huge fear into them, because now, and I think you see this with the Gen Zs a lot, that the men really don't have any concept of how to date or how to even approach a woman, because they're terrified. Like, what's going to be taken as an insult or too over the line? Like, where do you go? You can't, you know, and using the term making a pass at a girl I use very loosely, but, you know, how do you even begin to get their attention? How do you begin to date? Where do you cross the line? Can you kiss on the first date now? Or is someone going to say, oh, that was over the line? Like, guys are now terrified to date women because of the Me Too movement, because at any moment they could go, whoa, wait a minute, buddy.
Yeah. And I mean, there's definitely a big part of me that's like, welcome to the club. Women have been terrified forever of going on dates.
Right. You know? Of course. Right.
But there's all kinds of, like, you know, our worst fear is always like, this person's going to leave me sawed in half at the side of the road, you know? And there's plenty of reason to be terrified for that. So there's like some sympathy, but there's also, and, you know, but then there's also, as a woman, like, learning like, oh, now I have to fucking approach a man. That sucks. Like, you know,
all the chivalry's gone for sure.
Yeah. Well, not in Tennessee. That's, you know,
right. Yeah.
But so what you were saying, though, I do think it's important for survivors of sexual assault to acknowledge the humanity of the people that are the perpetrators, because it is, I think, the person that, you know, assaulted me, it's so hard to find the humanity in this person, because it's like the victims he chooses are teenagers, you know, he's such a predator. Like, it's so intentional and coercive and violent. But also, I think, you know, the more I can dig out the humanity and even try to, you know, in my meditations, when I feel scared, I went through a thing last month where I had weird stuff going on at my apartment. Someone broke into my apartment and didn't take anything. They just took the drawers out of my dresser. And then, like, someone was leaving stuff on my porch. And it was like, it triggered I haven't been that, like, PTSD triggered. I couldn't sleep for a week. I was sleeping with all the lights on. I was walking around my house with a taser in one hand and pepper spray in the other. And, you know, throughout that time, one of the only things that actually helped was meditating and sending love to people that were suffering, including myself. First, sending love and imagining women who went through the same kind of terror that I was experiencing to feel peace, to feel safety, to feel calm. And then after a lot of steps in between, raising my vibration to a much higher level, then I can start to send some compassion towards, the people that are terrorizing and violent. And what I mainly imagine is just that their attention is moving away from me and that they're surrounded in a healing light. And beyond that, that's their fucking problem. That's about as much compassion as I don't need to contemplate what trauma happened to you that you became this
right,
whatever. Yeah. But it does help to be able to attain that level, because me just spiraling down into terror and, just creating without injecting humanity into those people, they're monsters. And monsters are a lot scarier than just fucked up people. It's the same thing with I'm a very physically small person, and I've lived in a lot of major cities by myself. I learned a long time ago that if you just looked someone in the eye while you're walking past them that maybe you feel afraid of, and you smile at them maybe, or say hello to them, that power dynamic shifts instantly. Whereas if you're and I do this also, this is a thing for women, you see older men just staring at you sometimes. And what I used to do was just get really small and try to feel invisible. And now I just stare right back at them. And if they don't move their gaze, I'm like, can I help you? Is there something wrong with you?
Yeah.
And they get so embarrassed, So I think there's this level of actually connecting with someone's humanity where, you really shift the power dynamic.
Yeah, for sure. You seem kind of tough to me. I'd be a little intimidated by you, even if you're a tiny girl.
You have to be. You have to be when you're 5'2" and a woman.
There's already people in Southern California have kind of the television accent where it's kind of non-detectable, but I also detect a little bit of Chicago coming into this, and you're tatted up, and I'm like,
Well, yeah, I think that's also
this girl might take me. I'm 6'2", but I think she could take me.
I learned from a very young age that I was going to be always a lot smaller than people, and that would make them think that they could mess with me just for fun and to make themselves feel bigger. So I grew up doing martial arts. I grew up, trying to be tough because it's a defense mechanism, it's like anything else. But yeah, I mean, the tattoos also, it's funny now because I got so many of my tattoos in my up to my mid-30s, and I still get them because at this point, what's the point in not getting them? But it is funny how people just assume you have tons of trauma. It's such a tell. And I'm like, that's fine now, but I didn't think about that while I was getting them.
Wow. Well, I think especially with females.
Yeah.
To tat themselves up there, it's again, it's a form of rebellion in a way, or a statement you want to make about something. Wow. So much to unpack there. I want to move over to music for a moment.
Sure.
You talked about being in. You know what I want to do? I want to segue to talking about your bands with just a reference to the Go-Go's.
Okay.
Now, the Go-Go's, people don't realize that Go-Go's were started as a punk band. They later kind of became pop, but they really started as a punk band, an LA punk band in the height of the punk movement. Now, I'm 54 years old, so I grew up with punk. I had the Ramones and the Dead Kennedys and Dead Milkmen and early Go-Go's before they became pop, and a lot of other bands that I grew up liking until, the 80s fully set in, and I became a fan of, Duran Duran and stuff like that. Yeah. But it sort of emerged out of all that. That was such a big part of that movement into the 80s. And I always feel like the 80s is the best music of all, because disco kind of fed into the 80s and what pop music became. Punk music fed into what things could become, and then you had almost 10 years of this incredible British invasion pop music, and also the hair metal, which is some of my favorite music.
Yeah.
So you get into punk a little later, after a generation of people had it. But there's a great documentary on the Go-Go's. And it was really interesting to hear them talk about this. The Go-Go's had male groupies, and they tell stories that I've only heard like Gene Simmons talk about how much they took advantage of the men. Mm-hmm. They could make the men do anything. And Belinda Carlisle would talk about, oh, I'd have a groupie in and we'd be screwing in a stall in the bathroom. And then we go on stage, and I just thought, wow, like you don't hear it from like the female perspective of the power they had over all their groupies at that time, because you only really hear that with like the male bands.
Yeah.
And I thought it was almost like I know it's narcissism doesn't choose whether it's male or female. Right. So I'm sure there was a healthy amount of narcissism with that band. But it was a very interesting dynamic to hear it talked about with a female band for the first time. What do you think about that, for one?
I mean, there's such a power to becoming, when you've been objectified your entire life against your will, to becoming the objectifier, or even to like stepping on stage and being like, I'm making myself the sex object. I'm demanding this attention from you. And I'm in control of it. I'm in the driver's seat of it. So I was in a band, and I think inherently, like being in a girl band in that era is punk. You know, punk is not just like, I didn't grow up listening. I still don't listen to like, I couldn't name you a Misfit song. You know, I'm not someone that like, the reason I was called punk was because I was not a person that like could function as a normal human in society. And that was very evident in the way I operated in the music scene. So people would like, you know, if I got an album review or if people were, you know, talking about my music, they would describe it as punk. And I was like, okay, you know, sure. I guess if someone bangs the drums fast enough, it's punk music to a certain degree. So it also depended heavily on who I found that would play with me.
Sure.
Because I was just, you know, a singer-songwriter. And when I first started playing, I was only really finding guys to play with. I kind of hated that, because as much as the bands would end up sounding super tight and our performances would go well and it was fun and engaging, it was like, I don't connect with these musicians. And so I literally had bands that a lot of girls learn, not in Nashville, you know, everyone learns to play guitar when they're born here, but a lot of girls in LA that I was friends with, at least, you learn to play guitar in your 20s. You're not allowed to like play electric guitar and go have band practice when you're like in Pasadena, growing up as a girl. That just wasn't.
You're supposed to play the flute and the clarinet.
Right. You're supposed to stay quiet and do your homework in your room and go to bed. And so or classical piano or something.
Right.
So I was not a musician until my mid-20s. I learned to play guitar. And then it's like punk music is, you know, easy to play because it's G-A-E. If you can do an F chord, you're already like playing great shows. I was working with that, but then eventually I started a band called Pipe Dreams with this girl Jana, who I had started. I used to just walk up to female drummers. Anytime I saw them playing out, I would go up to the female drummer and I would ask them to jam with me because I didn't want to play with guys anymore. And so the only girl who ever said yes was this chick, Janet Jordan, who I love her. And she was like a very successful in the adult industry when she was younger. And when I first saw her play, it was a Melody Bar in Chinatown or Melody Lounge. It's this tiny little bar in Chinatown. And she was playing with like, I think it was like one of Ariel Payne's side projects or something. And it was this very, you know, cool indie night. And in the middle of the set, she was hot. So she took her shirt off and she just like had her tits out. And I was like, I've seen a million guys do this. I've never seen a girl do this, much less like a babe 10 out of 10 blonde chick who doesn't care. She's not trying to turn anyone on, but she's not mad about the attention. She's just owning that everyone's already looking at her tits anyway, and she's hot. So it's almost childlike, you know, it's almost just like, yeah, I have this amazing body and whatever, you need to see it so bad, here it is. And I ended up in a band with her, and she was such a showman. Like, she would take all her clothes off in our sets, and she would stand on the drums and pose and like had absolutely no shame. And that was like the beginning of me going from like trying to find outfits that were both like kind of sexy, but also not being like, I was trying to hide the fact that I was a girl because I just kept like I was only ever invited, even though my whole band was guys, I only would get invited to play shows on like, we're having an all-female fronted band night, or we're having a girl band night. And I'm like, this isn't a girl band.
Yeah.
This is like mostly dudes.
Did you feel that like seeing bands that were all male bands with a female lead singer was kind of a gimmick move? Is that how you think it's?
It was kind of all there was that I saw. There were a couple bands in LA at the time that were all girls, but it was much more rare at this time. And then like when I was in Pipe Dreams, it started to become like a thing. But the funny thing is other girl bands then started hating us because we were kind of playing up this whole sexuality thing. And we weren't that good also. We played for like 15 minutes loud, fast, and loose, and then we would just be gone. And what's funny though is we started being invited to like real bills with like where we were the only girls playing. And I was like, oh, finally, I'm like actually in a girl band, but now I'm not being invited for like girls' night. Like, here's our little girls' night at the Echo or whatever. So it was really cool. And it was a very different, I would like to what you're saying, like we had male groupies that would, before I played in Pipe Dreams, I would always be like, I'm going to carry my own amp and I'm going to carry all my own gear. When I was in Pipe Dreams, Jana was like, no. Like, we're not setting up anything. Like, we're going to go have our drinks in the back and these guys are going to set it all up for us. And in exchange, they get to hang out with us. And I was like, oh, there is power to being a girl. There is power if you like know how to both accept it and wield it. And there can be a lot of ugliness and a lot of shadow with that. But at the time, I was like in my late 20s, and that was a huge power shift for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it was always interesting because like the Pretenders, a lot of people looked at the Pretenders as a gimmick band, and people looked at Evanescence as a gimmick band. And, you know, when you had a female lead singer, interestingly enough, Van Halen almost had a female lead singer.
Oh,
and
wow.
At the last minute, they pulled the plug on having a lead singer because they were worried that they would come off now as a gimmick band.
Yeah.
And it was a struggle for them after Sammy Hagar left the band of who they were going to get. And they had Gary Cherone from Extreme, and that's one of the worst Van Halen albums ever put out, was with him. And then they went back to, you know, reforming classic lineups of the band. They did that. But I always felt like a lot of people did that. Are you in Nashville now?
I live in Nashville now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great music city. Have you ever seen the Dead Deads play there? Look up the Dead Deads. The Dead Deads started as an all-female band, and they have cycled in a male or two periodically. You will love them. You'll love their sound. Cool. You'll love what they do. Definitely a throwback to a lot of punk in that band. Very powerful band. They're based out of Nashville. They play around there all the time. They've gotten some national tours with bigger bands and went out on the road, but they're always playing locally in their hometown. But I think
it definitely sounds familiar.
Yeah, the Dead Deads are great. So, you know, I listened to some of your music, and I don't know if I would have called it punk. I think I would have called it more alternative, maybe, than anything.
Well, the recordings, absolutely. I had a band. I think the only band that you might even feel like that. I mean, Pipe Dreams, you probably didn't look up Pipe Dreams because that would be more of a deep dive.
Yeah.
That band, it's like, it would be me and a drummer would play our shows, and it would be like, you know, 15 minutes of chaos. So that was more of a punk band, but it was still like, it's still like more pop alternative rock and roll. It was more just like, we called the scene that, like I said, I'm not talking about the same type of music as like what people think of as punk music. It was more like the spirit of just like, we are not fitting into
a spirit and attitude
box. Yeah.
Yeah. And that term has definitely loosened up over time. So of what punk was originally. And also the term punk really was a term for juvenile delinquents, like a lot of young kids that were trouble. That was, you know, they took that slang term and they ran with it.
Well, and what I kind of like, I felt so embraced by the punk community when I had felt like I was just nothing but I grew up in this very, you know, like J. Crew sort of environment, and I never felt like I was accepted or fully fit in. And it wasn't really until I started like playing music and going to shows like that, the people were so nice to me. And it's so funny because people think of punks as this like like kind of tough crowd. And it's like, no, the tough people are like the upper middle class of society that are so competitive and cruel and tear each other down constantly. And the inclusivity of it and, meeting people from all kinds of different racial and economic and sexual orientation backgrounds. And it was like, the punk spirit had nothing to do with what kind of like music you liked or even, your politics. It was more about just like the inclusivity and having a place to go in society.
Yeah. I do think you're very talented. What I was able to find out there on the interwebs, I really liked. And that was definitely part of the reason I wanted to have you on. I think it's interesting, someone like me, I've seen 8-tracks, records, cassettes, CDs, digital audio tape, every medium there was. I watched kind of the collapse of the music labels, the rise of things like, obviously like iTunes and Spotify, and watching people not catch up. And I've always kind of been a predictive person. And I said a long time ago, I was really worried for record labels and how the business would change when you started hearing people talk about, 10,000 songs in your pocket on your iPod. I don't think people in the music business took that threat seriously on how it would destroy the physical media that you could deliver music on. And it did. And that was a huge hit financially to record labels, and also allowed a lot of independent people to be able to do their own stuff now that everything was a digital pipeline. And I think that's where the record companies lost. And I think the only way the record companies could have survived would have been if they owned the venues. Instead of seeing banks and corporations on the names of big venues, it should have been record labels. Because then you control the source in which the bands can now go to. They should have controlled ticketing, and they should have taken the venues, because when they knew they lost control of how people would record music in the future and produce their own stuff and put so many people out of business, all the way down to recording studios. So many recording studios shut down because you can now do incredible work in your own home.
Yeah.
I think that the labels really lost out, and they'll never have power again. And even though I think there's some nostalgia around people getting record players now, none of that's ever going to return. We're at a phase now where we lease music forever. Yeah. We subscribe to Spotify. We get access to 30 million songs. I can't tell you the last time I bought a CD. And now there's not even a place to get a CD. They've convinced the public to not own anything anymore and to just continually rent your music, but you get exposed to everything. So what's happened, because there's no record labels anymore, now there's hardly any money trickling down to musicians, even for bigger musicians. And that's why you see Fleetwood Mac and these big bands that are on their way out just selling their catalogs. Someone buy all the Eagles stuff for $700 million and let's call it a day. Yeah. They're done because there's no money trickling down. So I want to talk about that for just a moment. Sure. Are we doing okay on time?
Yes, I just have to be in a different meeting at 3, which for you is 4. So I have some.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, we're close to wrapping up. How hard was it for you with those bands? I mean, today you kind of need to have 1 million people following you on social media to even get any traction. Did you struggle with getting people to hear your stuff?
I mean, I just didn't honestly I didn't treat it like a job. It was always just a creative outlet for me.
Gotcha.
And it was more about having a social life for me also. I think there was like maybe a couple moments where I was like, ooh, maybe something's going to happen. And then when it didn't, it was like a little disappointing, but it also wasn't like, I didn't think like, oh, I'm going to become a career musician by starting in my mid-20s, Like, I already know it's such a competitive industry. Also, the other thing is I hate touring. I'm not. So I was like, that's never going to work because that's the only way you make money. And my idea of like an absolute nightmare is always being away from my cat and like having to pack every day. That's just like, I'm never going to want to do that. So, and also like, even just like after 30, I don't want to be in bars at night. I want to be in bed by 9 p.m.
Right.
I'm so much better suited to the life of a writer, where I'm like, I'm alone a lot. I'm wearing slippers all the time. And, it's like candles and coziness and good lighting is like a big part of my job now. But even, at the time, like it's more, I 1000% lost more money than I ever made as a musician, just buying gear, like getting to venues. I don't think I ever made more than $1,000 from a show. It was just, it was something that I did for attention and as a creative outlet. And it was really fun. So it was worth it in that department. But by the time I was in my 30s, I was like, could there be a creative outlet that comes with a bigger paycheck at some point?
Right.
And it naturally coincided with wanting to get back to writing anyway.
Well, I think we had a great conversation here about your life up to now. Totally. And I imagine so much of this has gone into the book.
Yes.
So would you say that the book was really, the ultimate therapy session for yourself, like recollecting all of that stuff and putting it in print? And even if no one ever, I always think about this in my own writings, if no one ever reads it, at least I got it all out, was it like that for you to do it that way?
What was so incredible about this book to me was that 90% of it, well, maybe less than 90, 60% of it at least though, I wrote in journals having zero concept of other people ever reading it. So there was this complete lack of self-consciousness. And, it's funny because now I wonder, who was I talking to, and I'll never be able to write like that again, because now every time I write a journal entry, I'm like, is this something? But like, I think the therapeutic part was that so much of the time I spent writing in journals throughout my 20s and 30s, early 30s was like, feeling a lot of guilt and a lot of shame around not becoming a writer, because that was what I had set out to do in my early 20s. And then I went on this whole other path. So it felt so full circle that the first book I had published was, like the writing that I had been doing the whole time. Meanwhile, me thinking I'm not a writer, I'm never going to be a writer. And then what gets published is me thinking I'm never going to be a writer, And so that was really impactful. And it has, what I think the most amazing part has been like the fact that people want to read this has given me the faith that like, now I'm finishing my second screenplay right now. And I am like doing my edit of my second draft of like a 300-page sci-fi fantasy book. So that was always like more what I wanted to do. And the fact that like people were, even interested in my journals gave me enough fuel and inspiration to be like, okay, like maybe being a writer is not something that's like off the table for the rest of my life. And maybe, it is more fun to play in bands in your 20s than it is to sit and write novels in your room.
Sure.
And I think the other part of it is just like the week that Meditations for Party Girls was published was like the same week that I went into AA. So I had been dabbling in sobriety for years. And it was when I finally that was when I got committed. So I will always look back on this book as being this like incredibly huge turning point in my life for sure.
Wow. That's great. That's a beautiful story. Are there any other takeaways you'd like to leave the listeners with the book? Are there anything incredibly dramatic you want to share or for people to look for? Or how will it help them?
So what has been really amazing is that to me, it's so hard to have any objectivity about what's in the book because I'm like, this is like my deepest personal life, but also it was so written without any intention of being like, I'm not telling anyone what to do. I'm not teaching anyone anything, but there's such a magic in and this is what I've learned in AA too. Like if you've been a part of a 12-step program, sharing your experience and how you have dealt with your struggles and like coped is so much more powerful than just telling someone like, I've read so many self-help books and it's so like unattainable sometimes, like the level of success someone has, or like, oh, here's an exercise, write 10 things. Like, it's not that kind of book, but it hopefully will help you just by showing, that you're not alone. And hopefully, like, I've had friends reach out, or people reach out after reading it and say that it's inspired them to, make more courageous choices, because even though to me moving to Mexico felt inevitable and not something that was like this huge brave choice, it was a leap of faith. And so yeah, I think it's a matter of like watching someone else deal with what is reality, how can I thrive in reality. It can be just as useful as like a how-to manual.
Do you find sobriety difficult at all? I mean, Nashville's a drinking, partying city. Mm-hmm. You're in the belly of the beast right there, with bars that stay open till 4 a.m. and tourists and just the alcohol, Tennessee whiskey everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I don't find it hard to not drink whatsoever. Like 99 out of 100 days. Probably even more than that. I miss weed almost every day, because weed is how I would sit down and focus on my creative projects and have.
You're off that too.
I'm not Cali sober, sadly.
I was going to ask you what you thought of that term, how ridiculous it is.
I love weed. If you can moderate weed, just smoke it for the rest of your life, because it's amazing. But I will quickly go from like, okay, I quit for a couple weeks, I'm just going to smoke one joint once in a while, to like the next day I'm waking up and smoking a bomb. So it's just not something that like I have any chill over.
Sure. Well, Caitlin, thank you so much for this interview. This has been a lot of fun. Can you tell the listeners how to find you out there on social media and the interwebs?
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate you inviting me. It was really wonderful. I am available on Instagram. It's Caitlin D, CAITLIN DEEE. So that's 3 E's. And that is probably my main social media platform. You can find me on TikTok once a year. And
you have a website though, right?
I do. It's just CaitlinD.com. Gotcha. And if you are interested in the book, it is available through dreamboybook.club is the publisher. And
Amazon.
It's on Amazon, yes, but I make more money if you order it from a publisher. So
of course, right.
I'll always encourage that.
Right.
He also has a bunch of other very cool writers on there.
Will there be an audiobook?
One day, maybe. I don't. I just don't. I have a speech impediment that like, I don't know if you picked up on it, but like sitting and recording an audio is my nightmare. So I won't be doing it. If there is, I didn't detect it.
Well,
good.
Anyways,
what it is.
thanks so much. And let's talk soon. Okay.
Okay. Thanks so much, Todd. I appreciate it.
Take care.
Thanks.
Metacortex Publishing hopes that you've enjoyed this presentation.
Please take a moment to listen to some other podcast offerings from Metacortex Publishing.
The Danceology podcast interviews the great masters of dance, the working professionals starring in today's most exciting shows, and the rising stars ready to amp up the craft. I'm your host, Edyta Stowenska from Dancing with the Stars. Join me as I dive into the world of dance, uncovering unique stories and the fascinating personalities of industry professionals on Danceology.
Hi, I'm Father Daniel Duplantis, a Catholic priest, martial artist, and host of the Karate Priest podcast. Have you ever wondered what the church teaches about different topics? Are you a martial arts enthusiast or just someone who wants to learn more about martial arts? I'd like to invite you to join me and many guests on my podcast as we cover topics of faith, everyday living, and martial arts on the Karate Priest podcast.
The No Earthly Explanation podcast investigates the things that are unexplainable. Hosted by world-renowned investigative researcher Donald R. Schmidt and scientist Ellie Ringo. Follow them as they look for evidence for things that have no earthly explanation. Available anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Every year, tennis players from around the world compete for excellence, triumphing against all odds to emerge the champions. I'm your host, Maddie Harrison. Join me as I get up close and personal with these dynamic individuals and find out what it takes to go for greatness. Let's go beyond the match.
Cult Following is a podcast that studies the personalities and common traits of cult leaders and their followers. Get the real story behind these infamous and oftentimes tragic cults from a new perspective, through exhaustive research, and from interviews with people that were there. Available anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Hi everybody, I'm Amber Rose, the religious hippie, and I host the podcast A Catholic's Perspective. Join me every 2 weeks as I release episodes targeted towards helping young Catholics navigate their ever-changing secular world while staying strong in their faith. Whether you are a Catholic or not, all are welcome here. So if this is something that interests you, feel free to tune in. You can find A Catholic's Perspective on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I hope to see you there. Bye!
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please be sure to rate and review this episode. This podcast is produced by Todd Fischer and Anthony Smith and is distributed by Metacortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Information and opinions stated in this podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Please be sure to visit the official website for Metacortex Publishing at metacortexpublishing.com or find us on social media for other unique content.